I would say that my favorite story, to your point, the sort of like penultimate example, is the papal ascension, if you will. If you remember back last summer, before Cardinal Prevost was actually elected by his colleagues as the Pope, there was actually Vegas odd makers, as well as all of the global media, gave him about a less than 1% chance of actually being elected by his colleagues to the Pope, except for 3 social network scientists who had actually been doing a body of research very specifically on looking at the connections across those folks who could potentially be the Pope. And the night before the election, they actually published a paper and said, we actually are going against all the Vegas odd makers, and based on our assessment of the connections, not the hierarchical roles, Cheryl, and we're going to get more into this, not the hierarchical roles, but the connections, we believe that Cardinal Prevost will be elected as the next Pope. And so in that moment, it was the completely counterintuitive. Obviously, 24 hours later, it became the, what we now know is the essential of Pope Leo. And what we really believe, what we look at, what this paper talked about, was that Cardinal Prevost's network looked more like his previous boss, if you will, Pope Francis, than other people. And so he didn't have the most hierarchical or positional or sort of traditional roles that we had seen. His network, the connectivity, the positivity, looked more like Pope Francis, if you will. And it was because I believe things that had happened over many, many decades, if not years, where he had built those connections. And so I'll steal a little bit of the punchline of our book, but the 4th window, when we talk about these 4 social agility windows, the last, what we saw is this idea of the fast risers. The fast risers, those people who are more likely to be promoted, more likely to have success when they're promoted, their networks look more like their bosses than their peers. And we have, through, again, my amazing colleague and friend, Michael Arena, who is former head chief talent officer at General Motors and at Amazon Web Services, and the author of Adaptive Space. We looked at this research, and it is what we would refer to as a stupiphany. It was both an immediate surprise and completely obvious at the same time. But when you looked at, again, Cardinal Prevost, and we're talking about this idea in the book that we call inevitable success, that in fact our promotability, our success, our career velocity is actually almost predetermined by the network we have. Now, that's not to take away from our human capabilities and competencies, but we believe increasingly so, and I know we're going to get into this in the next couple of moments, that our connections and our network, the positivity and the productivity of those networks, make our success actually almost inevitable. And the Cardinal Prevost, now Pope Leo example for us is just like, wow, who could have predicted it? And yet his network predicted his success in the context of he was elected by his peers into this role.
That is really amazing. I mean, and the word stupiphany, I'm not even sure how you spell that, but I'm going to be writing it down and remembering it. Greg, we are so happy to have you here. I know I had you kick off with a story, but we would love to hear more about you, your background, your career story, how you ended up in this amazing space, and about your work at Connected Commons.
Oh, well, thank you, Cheryl and Omer. Thank you for inviting me to join you and have this discussion today. So maybe in a quick snapshot, I'm a very long-term, human capital professional, if you will, talent leader, spent many decades. Cheryl, I consider myself a pracademic. It's really taking this idea of the research and evidence-based context, particularly in the area of social and human science, but most importantly, putting it into practice. I've seen there's such a wealth and interest of incredible academic and research-based work, and then there's incredible practical. But my experience, having done this for many decades, is I'd love to see more overlap of where we take that evidence-based research and we apply it with those actions. I think we're going to see more of that moving forward. I've had the privilege and pleasure to work for a lot of very well-known, amazing brands across a variety of industry. I spent time at Accenture, did many years. I was a partner there. I did 2 tours of duty at Merrill Lynch here in the New York area where I live now. And then I retired ultimately from Workday, where I had a chance to meet some of your colleagues and get invited onto this show. I had the privilege to be the people and performance evangelist, helping look after how do we think about this idea, both the human capital plus the social capital. And then for many years, I've had the privilege to work with my good friend and colleague Rob Cross, Deb Zehner, Michael Arena, and a variety of other folks in this consortium called the Connected Commons, where we bring together practitioners and professors to really look at how we elevate the role of social capital. And then most recently, I've had the privilege, and this is the end of my introduction or background, is to work with my good friend Kristen Cullen-Lester, who's a professor at Ole Miss. SIOP asked us, seeing, especially in this world of AI, how do we look at the social capital imperative? Kristen and I were asked by SIOP, or commissioned by SIOP, to bring together 50 of the world's thought leaders, again, both practitioners and professors in this area of social capital and specifically network analysis. And this past March, we published an 862-page a compilation of these 50 amazing thought leaders who we're so incredibly grateful to share the most current thinking on social capital and really how important the premium and the pressure that's going to be placed on that in this age of AI, which I know we're going to talk more about. But that's the sort of quick and dirty of a 40-year career.
Greg, thank you again for sharing your background. Really, really exciting, and we're happy that you are here. So let's get into it a little bit. You mentioned the word social capital several times, and I don't want to make the assumption that everybody who's listening knows exactly what that is. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Cheryl, thank you for the opportunity, and I forget that not everyone is as embedded in that as I am, and so thanks for taking a moment. You know, as a multi-decade practitioner in this space, I do think about the world. I think what 2 things are true in the world. We have this idea of human capital that, especially in the United States, we've been primarily focused on for decades and decades and decades. A little bit more advanced in other parts of the world, but equally so. And I think this is the area of opportunity, a tremendous opportunity, is this idea of social capital. So when I think about human capital, I think it's about the capabilities that I have, the knowledge, the skills, the experience, things that you and our colleagues around the world have been focused on growing forever. What most people may not appreciate is that there's research that suggests that 50% or 48% of our success is actually based on who we know and how we leverage those relationships. So you have sort of the heritage human capital, what I know, typical knowledge, skills, and capabilities. But what we also have is relationships where there is value in those relationships. And they typically give us access to new ideas. They give us access to influence, to decision making, to feedback. And so there is this parallel world. Human capital, I would suggest, is necessary but not sufficient. And what we're really helping to do is to elevate the role of social capital, which is to appreciate, candidly, as an example, what got me onto the podcast today. My relationship with Madeline on your team, huge fan of hers. She continued to sort of watch some of the things that I was doing, and the relationship I had with her from over many, many years. There was only one answer when she said, "Hey, would you be interested on the podcast?" It was absolutely, because of the relationship I had with Madeline. So there is value in our relationships. Again, I know that everyone knows this, back to this idea of the stupiphany, but most people don't fully appreciate the relational resources that it delivers you. The access to ideas, the access to decision makers, candidly, the access to, the ability to get up when you've had a hard day. It's the friend you call and you say, "I'm having a tough day." And she says, she's your energizer to get back up and say, "Hey, let me get you back up on the horse," if you will. So it's taking a look at this parallel universe, Cheryl, of the relational resources and the opportunities that are afforded to you based on the social capital that you've developed in a similar way to the human capital that you've developed.
That's amazing. Uh, I would love to come back to the Pope story, if I may, because I think, again, people listen to this podcast and you're just giving them a very big promise, right? Do you have a lot of like invest in your network, invest in your social capital, build that skill, and you will be successful. And if your network looks more like your boss's network than your peers, the odds of you being promoted increases dramatically. So, two questions there. A, can you elaborate a little bit just about what does it mean? What kind of network? Is it generic or do I need to be connected? Let's say, I don't know, I work in an organization like most people are. Do I need to be connected to people from within organization, external to organization? What does it exactly mean? And how can I be basically the next pope to connecting to your story? And second question, is it a skill or is it just an intention to just connect to people?
Yeah, so Omar, thank you, and you'll have to kick me under the virtual table if I geek out too much on this. But let me take a moment to address that. First, let me do a myth bust because again, I sometimes forget with new folks or new audiences. I am not talking about '80s networking. All right, just to break that myth. What we actually now know in the today's world is that we are likely all suffering from collaboration overload. What we now know is that bigger networks are not better; they're actually overwhelming. It's what I would say, Omer, is this idea of intentional and authentic networks. Not networking as an action, we'll get into the skill in a moment, but it's my ability to look at my network. And actually, if we look at Robin Dunbar's work in this space, which I know many people are probably familiar with the idea of Dunbar's number, neurologically, we can actually only manage about 150 active relationships. And I won't get too much into the neuroscience of relationships. But it's the intentionality by which we say, what's the work I'm doing now? And how does my network optimize my ability to do that? By looking at the relational benefits. I'm going to geek out for one moment to your point on talking about two different types of networks from the network science space. One is this idea of bridging networks. Bridging networks are the diverse networks that we have across functions, across companies, across career levels. And bridging networks give us access to new ideas and they help us diffuse new ideas. And so there's an intentionality around what we refer to these bridging or open networks. Then we have this idea of bonding or closed networks. Closed networks, to your point, Omer, are do I have a productive social cohesion with the people I work most directly with? I need both of these ideas. Bonding or closed networks enable me to actually have higher experimentation, to have higher psychological safety, to deliver faster and with accelerated ways. What we know through the research is that it's not one or the other, but it's the oscillation back and forth between these two networks at different times within one's career is actually what delivers this career velocity. And so this idea, and Michael writes about it in his book, Adaptive Space, is how do I go to these discovery networks that are open to get access to new ideas? Then I put my arms around a small number of teams, what Amazon would refer to as two pizza teams. I have high psychological safety. I get things done. Then I open the network back up again to get those ideas pulled into the universe. And then I go and I deliver those ideas typically again through these closed or bonding. So it's the intentionality and the authenticity by which I grow, develop, nurture these networks to enable my success. Sorry for geeking out on that, but I appreciate the opportunity to clarify and myth bust a little bit on this. Is not like, no, 1,000 people go out there and network. In fact, we don't have the time or energy to do that anymore.
Well, I absolutely love you're using one of my favorite words, Greg, and that is intentional. And I think that's really important about what you're saying because we are very busy and there are so many different things going on in our world today. And so your perspective on putting yourself like really focused into building those networks and not your 80s networking is really important and I think for me personally is already a key takeaway from this conversation. So thank you for that. Thank you for that.
And Cheryl, what we see to your point is we see these sort of four, in some of the work that we're doing, we see these four very intentional networks. We see these four, sort of in the various career windows. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a couple of moments. But what we've been able to do is sort of identify that oscillation back and forth and say, am I being intentional about the network I need at this particular sort of career stage? Or given the work or the context of the work I want to do, it's the intentionality of oscillating. And I think we're going to, in a couple of minutes, maybe double click into those four networks. We talked about the last one, the Cardinal Prevost one, which is what we call the fast riser network. And that's this network that looks like essentially more like your boss's network than your peers' network. And there are three others that, as we have time, I'd love to share the context for.
Yes, well, we could get into that now because you do talk about these four network patterns of successful people: fast movers, fast shapers, fast scalers, and as you just mentioned, fast risers. So by all means, have at it. Share with us what those are and what is it about those behaviors that successful people master.
Yeah, no, thank you. And so we had much of this work actually. I mean, again, it's the work that my colleagues and I have been doing for a long time and living and breathing in this research. But about, I guess, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we had a chance to write a cover story for the Harvard Business Review on this idea of the fast movers. We had been seeing that as we have, anticipating this age of AI, seeing the need for organizational agility. My colleague Rob Cross and I and David Sylvester, who's currently the head of talent at Boeing, sat down and we saw this trend of this increased agility. We saw people moving onto teams more frequently. We saw the need to build what we refer to as this idea of social agility. And we had a chance to look at 300 networks, and then we had a chance to interview 100 people. And with the fast mover networks in particular, and what we wrote about in the Harvard Business Review article, is this idea of the intentionality of building your network very intentionally up front and being able to position yourself. And what we found was a small group of people, about 15% of the people in our research, who were able to replicate the networks of high performers 3 times faster than their peers. And so we looked at this network analysis, and what we saw was how quickly did it take someone to become appropriately central within the network, where when other people were asked, if Omar was asked, who do you go to get your work done? When Omar started to identify Greg as one of those people, we could see that he had found that the newcomer, if you will, or the new joiner, had found their way more appropriately into the center of the network. And there were a set of very specific skills. So Omar, I don't think I answered your previous question on, are these skill-based? There are absolutely behaviors and applied skills. I'll give one super specific example. One of the things we found was that so often when we meet a new person or we join a new team, we're often asked as the new person, hey, Greg, tell me about yourself. And we do that. We fall into this trap. And we're so excited to be part of Growth Space. And we say, here's all the things I've done in the past. Maybe I share what I did at one of Growth Space's competitors. And you're like, that's not really like activating inclusion for me. What the fast movers did was they paused for a moment. And if, Cheryl, I was meeting with you, I would say, Cheryl, I can't wait to share with you my experience and why I'm so excited to be at Growth Space. But before I do that, if you could share what's your priority and what's important to Growth Space as an organization, I'd love to provide that in the context. And so fast movers, these people who replicated the networks 3 times faster, aligned their expertise to the new organization's context. And 2 things happened there, Cheryl. Neurologically, when I did that, we process, initially, everyone we meet, we process as a foe. And it's not until we decide, our brain, that we're going to process them as a friend. So you are a foe until you are a friend. What I do when I do that, and I don't mean this to sound Machiavellian, but these are sort of neuro hacks to accelerate how quickly I can be seen as an insider. I can be seen as a colleague who can make a contribution. 2 things happen. One, you're more open to me in saying, hey, now I'm going to share with you. Cheryl, you talked about priority ABC. Here's a person I know who might be helpful. Here's a thing I did in the past. Here's an article I wrote that might help us do that. Neurologically, it accelerates you seeing me as a friend, someone who can help us out. There's a secondary effect. You're meeting with Omer in a week or so, and Omer says, I'm working on this problem. And you say, I just met this new guy, Greg. I think he's one of us. I think he'll help us be successful. You trade your social capital on my behalf to Omer. Omer reaches out to me and says, Cheryl says great things about you. Could I ask for your help on this thing? So there are these very specific skills that work with the way our brains process networks, relationships that we can do to apply to get appropriately pulled into the network. I know I went into probably more detail than we have time for on that, but I just wanted to make it super practical. And again, people are like, you needed to do 5 years of research to come up with that. But I can't tell you how many people I talk to and they say, that makes total sense, and I would never do it on my own.
No, but the nice thing about this is, again, most people are very focused about themselves, right? What do I want to achieve? Where do I want to go? And you're saying, and I think it's not only the organization, and actually it's nice because I think most people do not like to kind of like push their networks in a very like aggressive way, but what you're saying is something else. It's not to go to networking events and meet a lot of people and make the connections, but whoever you meet, if you align yourself to their organization and probably to their personal, like, hey, Greg, how can I help you to be successful as Greg? Not only as Greg in the context of Growth Space or Workday or the organization you work for. Then I get a lot of the points, and then like our bond basically became stronger.
And it's accelerating that bond over exactly to your point. It takes us actually 200 hours, the research on this, it takes us 200 hours to build that friendship typically. What we're doing is we're using these, and again, I don't mean to sound in any way Machiavellian, these sort of neuro hacks of saying this is the way our brains work to accelerate that. And I really believe, and I know we're going to talk more about this, but in this age of AI, where the cognitive capabilities will be increasingly, managed or used in AI, it puts this pressure and premium. There won't be the time to storm, form, norm until we perform anymore. And so this skill of what we refer to as social agility, being able to execute that in a way that builds the psychological safety that our friend Amy Edmondson would talk about, is critical for us to get on to the work of the work in these irreplaceable human skills.
That is powerful stuff. I could seriously sit here and talk to you literally all day about this, Greg. I find it so fascinating and very, very relevant for where we are right now. But I want to make sure we have time to talk about your upcoming book. Your book, Inevitable Success: Empowering Social Agility in the Age of AI. You tell us of some stories. The word inevitable, that alone I could get into, but the inevitable success, the likes of Alexander Great, Mary Shelley, Post Malone, Billie Eilish. These are seemingly unrelated, but what's the thread between all of these amazing human beings that have walked our planet?
Yeah. So Cheryl, so what we've done is we're telling this idea of social capital, yes, through some of the science. You can't take the science out of my colleague and I, but we feel like to see it through the lens of a Cardinal Prevost, who's the surprising rise of the first American Pope, to see the rise of Ursula Burns, who was the CEO of Xerox. And we're taking the lens of people who we believe over decades, back all the way to Alexander the Great, Benjamin Franklin, and say that it is our social agility. It is these irreplaceable human skills that we believe have always been the bridge in transition. So when we talk about, as an example, Post Malone, if you were to go rewind back to I guess it would be the beginning of 2024, you would know Post Malone as a rapper. If you fast forwarded to the end of 2025, you see the Post Malone is in charge, is the head of all the country music charts. And you're like, how did that happen? What would enable someone to transition from fans in one genre to fans in another? And the answer I would suggest is Dolly Parton. Dolly Parton, Post Malone's relationship with Dolly Parton enabled him to have a set of legitimacy, enabled that those connections to be accelerated, and the intentionality by which he engaged with different artists of different genres. He was able to build that fanship, back to Omer's point, not push his way into the country fanship, if you will, but to actually get pulled by intentionally using the different producers, partnering with all, and ironically, right, one of the famous, teamwork makes the dream work. And I would say it was the Dolly Parton factor. Knowing Dolly Parton, having a relationship, and asking her to trade her social capital enabled his transition from one genre into another. Not pushing his way in, but actually getting pulled in by the fans of the partners that he had, as one example. So we're taking a step back and we're looking at Alexander the Great, Billie Eilish, Benjamin Franklin, Ursula Burns, and we're really revealing their networks in perhaps ways that we didn't think about from a human capital lens, their talent, but say it was their relationships that enabled them to have access to new audiences, to have new opportunities, to invent and be creative. And we ultimately talk about in the book that it's your network that enables you to have these four essential human, irreplaceably important items. And that's this opportunity of trust, time, ideas, and influence. We don't believe, at least in the foreseeable future, that these four situations will be replaced by AI. And so it's these essential human capabilities to accelerate trust, to be thoughtful about time and not suffer from that collaboration overload, to have access to ideas, and to be able to influence. And we believe these are, again, for the foreseeable future, irreplaceable human capabilities. They are advantages that we need to rely on. And each of these four windows speaks to these different ideas. So what the fast movers did in our research was they accelerated trust. And then we talk about how we do that. The second window, which is our fast shapers, what's interesting, at least to me, Cheryl, is you actually, when you're new to an organization, it's really important to accelerate how you get pulled into that network. And then, interestingly enough, when you've done that successfully, you need to do the absolute counterintuitive thing. You need to stop getting pulled to the network because you're going to become overloaded. You're going to find yourself too central. The second network of people, what we found, was then the fast shapers. They were the people who put the brakes on getting pulled too central, doubled down on getting delivery of a few things, and shaped their network to reduce collaboration overload. Then the third window is what we call these fast scalers. The fast scalers then take a product and they diffuse it and their reputation out back into these open networks. They get their ideas pulled into the universe rather than try to push them. And then the final network that we talked about is the fast risers. So in the book and in the research, we talk about these four very specific networks. What do they look like? How open or closed they are? And we use these fascinating examples of, why did Mary Shelley, who is the author of Frankenstein, she wrote that book on a winter where she buffered herself from the busyness of London. She needed to get her head space. She was one of these fast shapers, if you will, who got away from the chaos of London and went and had the inspiration to write Frankenstein as an example.
Greg, you had it at hello. We are completely in. I'm like hanging on every word. But my question for you now is how do you develop those skills? I know that there are HR leaders and other listeners out there right now who are thinking the same thing, like, okay, this all makes perfect sense. I am in. Tell me how, Greg. How do we go about developing these skills?
Cheryl, what I would tell you is the big, and again, as I would consider myself not a former, but a current, talent, learning leader, I would ask and really encourage everyone to at least begin to explore this idea of social capital added to human capital. We have been so focused on the human capital for so long, and it's necessary but not sufficient. what I would encourage people to do is to read the great research of my friend Rob Cross, of Ron Burt. I mean, there is this huge Kristen Cullen Lester. There's a huge amount of research out there that talks about this invisible, historically invisible idea of a social capital, and begin to understand how you leverage social capital in the context of learning. As an example, I know so much of our audience here are learning experts. I will tell you, I had this light bulb go on for me when I became more intentional about saying, when I bring people together as learning cohorts, I would actually design the cohorts to maximize the network benefits that they would get, the connection benefits in the context of organization design. So that would be like one super specific example, somewhat counterintuitive. Typically, we looked only from a human capital lens. Greg is relevant for this program. What I now see is my good friends Michael Campbell, other people are saying, I'm going to actually build the cohorts of learning to develop as much social capital as I am human capital. And so thinking about this as an untapped lever and something that's going to be so much more important in the future. So there's a shocking amount of research, actually, decades of research in this idea of adding the social capital lens. And I would just, even if you engage with GPT chat or your favorite LLM and say, hey, let's start to have a conversation on social capital. How might I consider it in my world? What would be some of those skills? Again, I'm happy to provide this audience with more books than they could ever consume, more articles. Folks are welcome to go out to connectedcommons.com. We have all of the research, decades of articles that we published there on the really specific outcomes that we would hope people would achieve with social capital.
That's brilliant. I think so. We have two takeaways for our audience. I think the first one was whenever you speak to someone, first align to their organizational context, align to their context, and try to basically wave your way in through their context. Great insight. The second one is if they're like learning talent practitioners and you're designing learning experiences, design them with this in mind, with their networks, with their basically social capital in mind. I will share from us one of our top fastest growing products, the growth space, is group skill development, which is interesting because it's basically instead of one person working with an expert on a topic, which I would consider the most efficient way to develop a skill, because I can meet with Greg. I don't need to meet with Greg with six other people. But we see organizations leaning more and more toward this group concept. And yes, you will have less of Greg's personal attention, but you will benefit from creating these connections, which is brilliant. So I think I'm seeing the audience already doing that without totally understanding. I think now it's even clearer.
Omar, your thought is a great segue into one of the last questions, not the last question, but one of the last questions I have for you, Greg. What responsibility do you believe companies and HR leaders have to helping employees develop those skills? Is sharing their experience in growth space that companies are already leaning into this. But so what do you think the responsibility is for organizations and HR leaders, especially in the age of AI?
Yeah, I think and the context that you said, in this age of AI, I think I don't want to at all take away from the importance of learning AI skills, and whether that's prompt engineering in that first phase or agentic AI, or, we need to learn and understand. And that is, again, necessary but not sufficient. I can't think of, and now I'm biased on this, but I can think of, in this age of AI, once I've learned those skills, I can think of a second more important skill to maintain my relevance in this age of AI than building the skill of social agility. And what we mean by social agility is the ability to quickly build those productive and positive relationships that allow me to take advantage of trust, time, ideas, and influence. And so, again, I get it on the AI side. We need to learn those skills. I'm super biased, but I would say if you could help people learn a skill that will help them be relevant. And I do think there's an interesting phenomenon right now that when we ask people to learn AI skills, what I see in the research at least is there's anxiety. The anxiety comes from you're asking me to learn a skill that's going to replace me. You're asking me to learn a skill to incorporate AI, and I know I need to do it, but it's got this dual message. I believe when we look at these irreplaceable human skills, that sends the message to people is, I want you to learn this skill, but here's what you'll leverage to remain relevant in the future. You know, it's interesting. Sam Altman, the CEO of GPT Chat of OpenAI, it recently was interviewed, and he said the question he is most asked by any audience is not about AI. The question he is most asked by people is, what should I coach my son or daughter to do or learn to be relevant in the age of AI? Nothing to do with the tech. You've got one of the smartest, most informed people on technology in the world there. And what people at the end of the day want to say is, I need to remain relevant. I believe that social agility, I can't think of a skill that increases my relevance more than this idea of social agility.
Wow, that is powerful. I had a conversation with a leader yesterday who has two kids, twins who are going off to college, and they are stuck trying to figure out what they should study because everything is moving so quickly. They're wondering if am I going to select something now that is going to be irrelevant 2 years from now. So it is a very interesting time, an exciting time to be here on this planet experiencing what's happening with AI. And I couldn't agree with you more, Greg, about the power of social agility and what that brings to just not to our workplace, but then also to our world. So thank you. I have one final question for you, Mr. Pryor. And this
Yes,
is going to take you
please.
back. I want you to go back to your prior self, your prior,
Which
your
is
prior
relevant for
younger
me.
self.
I can always go back to my
Uh,
prior self. Yes.
when you were,
That's the only self I can go back to is
it's the only stuff you can go back to, right? When you first started out as an HR leader, what is some advice, if you can go back to that younger self, what's some advice you would give yourself?
oh my gosh. I love that question. It's a great question. So for me, it would be very clear, and I think all of us in the space of the work that we do, it's to become absolutely focused on the outcomes we're trying to achieve. I had the privilege in my first boss in the work world, a gentleman by the name of Charlie Walsh. He was brilliant, and I didn't. I now see as I think about your question, I see this thread in so many of the people I've had the privilege of working with, that their success was focused on these outcomes. What is the business, organizational, competitive trend? To begin with the end in mind? The great Stephen Covey, obviously. What's the outcome I'm trying to achieve? I think about, as an example to your point, my former boss and great friend and colleague Stephen Rice would say, "Fall in love with the problem and not the solution." And that always, I was like, Stephen, I don't know if I love that, because I don't know if I want to love problems. What he was saying, again, now in retrospect, was be focused and fall in love with the outcome you're trying to achieve, and then have the solution. And I think for many times in my career, I love a really interesting, pioneering solution. But I think we're at this unique opportunity, Cheryl, and what I would encourage everyone to do is anything they're working on, take a few minutes with your favorite LLM, whoever that is, and take 15 minutes while you're having lunch, as an example, or having a quick coffee break, and connect whatever you're doing back to the problem it's solving. When I started off my career, it would take us a really long time to do business cases, if you will. You can do that now with GPT Chat in 15 minutes and say, how do I trace back the value, the outcome of what I'm doing to this outcome? And I think if you can now position that with whoever you're talking about, when they say, well, why would we change our performance management more? Or why would we care about social capital? Understanding the outcome and the value specifically, being able to maybe reference only one piece of research. My colleagues and I can tell you how, as one example, super specific example, that 15% of an organization is connected and influences 85% of a company. I am a recovering change management professional. Back in the day, when we would say we would typically get leaders to sponsor change programs, the research now says that 15% of people is not the senior leaders. They're spread out through organizations. And so if I can identify very efficiently and effectively the 15% of people in the organization who influence 85% of the outcome and engage them as the sponsors, the energizers, and the challengers in my change program, I will accelerate the change program. I will both increase the likelihood of success and I will accelerate the time to success. That is what people want to hear. If I can say I will deliver with greater certainty and greater speed the outcome that has a business benefit by using this strategy, that's why people care about that. So connect the dots. Be able to very succinctly and very specifically say this solution should produce this outcome with greater success, less cost, and more thought. And while we do love our solutions, we've got to be cautious of being so in love with the solution that it doesn't connect to an outcome.
That's absolutely amazing. Greg, have to thank you. Uh, I mean, I've learned so much, Omar. I know that you have too. On the behalf of the Skilled Podcast, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us, giving us a lot to think about, giving us a lot to go back, to our desks and to our laptops and iPads, etc., to research and to continue to learn and grow. Wishing you all the best success with your book, your research, and Connected Commons. And I, for one, am going to be a real intentional fast mover and stay in touch with you, sir. It was beautiful meeting you.
Thank you, Cheryl. And thank you for all of your work, and Omar, all of your work. So grateful for how you're enabling and empowering and maintaining this relevance in this next world of work. Really appreciate it.